Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties episode 13. It's been a while in this year. We're almost halfway through the year. And, I suppose it's after the budget, so we're going to be talking about what happened last week in Manchester. Well, more so the topics related to what happened in Manchester. I think it's pretty obvious what happened.
Yeah.
And we'll be talking about the Uluru reconciliation. So joining me, we have Zeev in Melbourne.
G'day.
And Lee joining me from West Australia, as always.
Hello.
So I suppose let's get into it with hashtag not all Muslims.
Yep.
I'm kidding. But, the Manchester sort of attack has brought out the usual sort of thing. Actually, is it too late to have like the UK flag in like a transparent thing around my face, just so I can virtue signal about this?
No, it's never too late to do that.
Can we set that up? Is it possible?
No, not right this second. Hang on, you keep talking and I'll see if I can figure something out.
Yes! So I'll be able to virtue signal this entire episode.
Right.
Brought to you, Lee, obviously. With
You're not making crass comments about the nature of a guy who killed 30 people or something in a bomb, are you, Vikas? Just say yes.
Maybe.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe.
Just be honest and say yes.
Yes. So here's the thing. Like, every time one of these things happens, the usual people come out and say, we got to stop all the Muslim immigrants, this person. And I heard a particular interesting claim that this person's a second-generation asylum seeker, at which point I was scratching my head.
Yeah, that's a bit of a long bow.
Anyone who's ever dealt with immigration at any point should be scratching their head, because there's no such thing as a second-generation asylum seeker, because once you're granted asylum, you become a permanent resident, and thus your children born in this country, because Australia, like the United Kingdom, is a birthright country, your children would be citizens of Australia. They would not have any citizenship claim to the country you came from. So it's not so much that he's a second-generation refugee, he's a first-generation Brit. Now, I don't know why this distinction has to be made, because quite frankly, it doesn't make sense. Like, as a claim, it's just like, oh, this person's a second-generation Muslim. I'm sitting there going, second-generation asylum seeker. Yeah. Anyway, I pointed out my confusion to this.
Okay, because you now have a UK flag over your face. So,
fantastic.
Congratulations.
You feel my virtues.
Yeah.
It's just going out there. Love and feelings for everyone.
Right. Well, I mean, leaving aside that point for a moment, I mean, the bigger issue that they're bringing up, really, and it's the issue of how English society or UK society is coping with what you would call the integration of this sector of its population. And
actually, that is something that I that's an actual equity under the law sort of argument, and I find so the thing is, the report came out that this guy was on the police's radar, and they were too afraid to take him in because of they feared a charge that they could be being racist by bringing him in. And I sat there going like, okay, is that you saying that, or is it the fact that what you had on him was really, really light, and any civil defense attorney would have been able to sort of, get them off it? So the question for me is, if it's the former, right? If it's the case that they had something on him, and their public relations team basically went, it's not strong enough to warrant going after him, then that's something that needs to be addressed in terms of, yes, the police should be going after actionable, like when they have the proof, they should definitely go after him. In fact, that's what policing is about. But if it's the latter, and it's that it was a light sort of thing, and now they're just saying, oh, look, we had a hunch and we didn't go after it, then I don't feel that's as much warranted, because I mean, theoretically, you could stop 1 million crimes if you just lock people up into prisons.
Yeah.
I mean, but
and that's often the issue with a lot of these people is and what you find in the US is that the FBI come across people who say, stupid things on social media like, death to the kafir or whatever, and then they go send an informant to get in contact to offer, training or, to offer explosive or to hatch a plan. Like there's been a number of cases where essentially the FBI has approached idiotic people who are disaffected and offered them the ability to carry out their plans and then arrested them for it, despite the fact that they probably wouldn't have done anything if it wasn't for the FBI. Like if the FBI hadn't have intervened, there would have been no plot because they're just clearly too stupid to do what they're doing. So,
I don't know if that's what people are really concerned about in this case. I mean, I think what they're really concerned about is the issue of integration. Whether they're first generation or asylum seeker or what have you, they see this as a major problem. And I think that's really what needs to be addressed. If we look at it from a libertarian or classical liberal perspective, that's the case that isn't succeeding with the public at the moment.
So as a libertarian, I would actually say it's probably really bad if they integrate with the rest of Australian culture, because the rest of Australian culture is quite socialist.
Right.
I would be much happier if they integrated more with libertarian culture and sort of understood property rights. Things our government doesn't believe exist. I would be much more happier if they integrated with us and less so with the Australian government. I'd be very happy with that. Sorry.
Okay.
I guess what I would say is that there's a real danger that we're not making the case as much as we should, or that it's not reaching the people that it should for the basic ideas of Western society. That counts for both, and by that I mean equality under the law, property rights, basic classical liberal ideas that people here largely accept, and then they say, but we need 100 exceptions. Well, actually, we need to teach the basic principles first. And if we manage to do that, and if we manage to do that across our community, then that will be a good start.
I was just going to say, I was going to bring up the point. So there's a lot of talk about integration, but it doesn't seem to me that the issue is they don't understand the ideas, because in most of these cases, we're talking about people who were born in the country that they attack, or have lived long periods of time there. Some of them have been, like with the kids who shot, I think Curtis Cheng. I think they were basically raised in Australia, even if they came here very young. So, you're talking about people who actually do understand what Western sort of civil culture is about, but they reject it. I think the issue is not so much integration, because they speak the language. They probably know all the things that regular 20-year-olds in England would know. The issue is actually alienation and embracing violence, which is something that's actually a relatively new thing when you look at the history of terrorism. So, Islamic jihadist violence really didn't exist before late 90s, like when Al-Qaeda started attacking, like in terms of in the West, that is, or, against Western targets. Before Al-Qaeda in the late 90s, when they started bombing US embassies in Africa, basically it didn't exist. There was violence within Middle Eastern nations or Muslim nations, or, in Sri Lanka, where you've got an Islamic minority but it's kind of ethnic as well. You got issues there, but it's not we need to destroy the Westerners and Western culture. That's a relatively new thing, and I think one of the issues for the nationalists that I talk to is they don't really have much of an answer for that. They don't really say, they'll say, Islam's the threat. Yeah, but it's only right now that it's a threat. For 1,400 years, it wasn't a threat. There was, they'll point to the Ottomans invading Europe, or the Moors invading the
Spain.
Iberian Peninsula, but firstly, those are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and it's empires invading other empires. It can be explained not by Islam, but just invading other people when you're an empire. That's what they did back then. Everybody did that. It's not unusual for Muslims. So, sorry, Vikas, you kept wanting to jump in and say something.
Yeah, I can jump in. So, you're right that it's... So, what is unusual about what's happening now is that the conflict, I guess you could say the theater of conflict, has moved to areas that aren't actually directly involved in the conflict, right? But the idea of attacking, the structures and the I guess you could say the stratification of the occupying empire is nothing new. In fact, the Israelis, the Zionist movement in particular, in 1920s, were famous for their various bombings of hotels, which people might not know the history of now. Sorry, which people might not be aware of. But yes, the Zionist movement, the guys who were ultimately, in the end, responsible for the creation of the State of Israel, did bomb hotels way back.
Like to inflict civilian civilian casualties? Was that the goal, or just to scare people? Because, the IRA bombed lots of places, but often they were evacuated. They'd let them know ahead of time.
They would usually call in advance, they would
say. Yeah, no, they didn't with particular ones. So they were politically targeted. Which
movement, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. They were politically targeted. That's the difference. They weren't intended to target the civilians.
Right, okay.
So India as well, during our freedom struggle, which is what we call it, it saw a lot of British armories, a lot of British military installations that were targeted, and sometimes that resulted in civilian casualties. So what's his name? Bahari Bose, I think. Anyway, so basically he was the terrorist of India at the time. So there's loads of history where installations or the stratification of the occupying entity have been targeted, and in that sense, it's not really that different what these guys are doing. The difference is how they've managed to carry the theater from where the conflict is actually happening. So I'm talking your Syrias, your Iraqs, your Afghanistans, and have managed to drag it to effectively areas that are very ancillary to how this, to how that conflict is actually being resolved. So, for example, like those kids at the Ariana Grande concert had nothing to do with British soldiers stationed in Afghanistan. Maybe some of them were cousins or related somehow to some of those soldiers. But effectively,
it was just indiscriminate violence. They were just that was a place there was lots of people. Let's go to somewhere with lots of people and set bombs off.
Correct. And the thing is, if you take a look at it, like the ASIO chief said the other day, that the link that the ASIO's position wasn't that there was a link between Islam and Muslims and terrorism. He said he was laughed at effectively for saying, there's no link between like the religion and the terrorism. And to be fair, that's a statement that, like, if you know anything about these players and in the Middle East, you have to realize ISIS is not liked by anyone else in the Middle East, right? They have a version of the Quran and the state that they're trying to build that is almost universally opposed by everyone. I'd say
except Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I was about to say like except Saudi Arabia, but the point is like the Wahhabists in Saudi Arabia are pretty much
not the Saudi government though. The Saudi government doesn't want these guys.
But that's just a political ploy, Lee. That's the Saudi monarchy and the Saudi society are two very different things.
Yeah,
Saudi
correct.
monarchy is using Wahhabism to keep power, but Saudi society is actually quite radical and religious, unfortunately. Look, Lee. I mean, and Vikas, what you're saying is true, but I think that
what I'm trying to get at is there's no sort of fix to this that you can learn from the past, because things are a little bit different. And like for example, the IRA's bombings went down drastically when they were giving political franchise. Indian independence stopped, the Bahari Boses from bombing military installations of the British Empire completely, right?
Well, yeah.
Like these like political franchise ended lots of acts of terrorism that used to occur in the past, right? And in some other cases, they went for rank extermination as well, and that was another potential solution. And there are probably really good historical examples of that, which aren't coming to my mind.
The Tamils essentially were defeated, and and FARC in Colombia. I mean, I think they had bombings and whatnot during their time, and they've more or less disbanded now, I think. So, I mean, I think actually the best example is during the 60s and the 70s, there was a massive bombing campaign by a range of left-wing radical organizations in the US, and there was hijackings and all sorts.
The Weathermen,
guys like the Weathermen, and it just kind of stopped. You know, like, all during the 60s, like we're talking like thousands upon thousands of bombings by a variety of organizations.
And they got into the universities. They got jobs at the university.
Well, yeah, I guess that's an explanation. Yeah, but I mean, even like hijackings, they just kind of, there was a wave of them, and then they just kind of stopped. And I think, I mean, that's not to say that that's what's going to, I mean, it's one of those things like, until it happens, you can't predict it. Like, it will happen or it won't. But I mean, it kind of appeared out of nowhere. It could just kind of go away out of nowhere. I certainly don't think you can bomb your way in foreign countries out of this.
Nowhere. I don't think they go into nowhere. I think there's a catalyst that stops them.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't think I mean, at the end of the day, what's causing this is two factors. One, nationalism. Two, Islamism. Nationalism in the sense of a particular region or ethnic group is very unhappy about its current situation. Pick a place in the Middle East and Iraq, Syria, what have you, they're unhappy. Two, and it can be any given ethnic grouping, the Kurds, the Iraqis of various sects, Sunni, Shia, etc. Two, Islamism. Islam, and this nationalism, by the way, it's a relatively recent thing. To Islamism as an outgrowing from traditional Islam and a kind of a meld, if you will, of nationalist and Islamist ideas into one modernist
interpretation of it. Yeah.
Which is why state calls itself Islamic State. I mean, the idea of a state is actually quite modern in a way, and not necessarily Islamic in the sense that in some religious sense. So I guess first of all, the key point here is it's an outgrowing of a religious or ideological idea that has some significant sway, and yes, it can justify violence. The next point to make, of course, is that it's not the only religious interpretation. There are others, and there are, frankly, a lot of Muslims who don't care for religion either way. And the final point to make is that it would be a crazy idea to validate and enable these people by basically by punishing the whole group of anyone you vaguely identify as a Muslim. And in that way, nothing would do more to empower those radical Islamist groups. And those are very dangerous groups too, that are gaining power sometimes. And they don't need more help, frankly, from idiot Westerners who think they can play armchair theologian and assert that the whole of Islam is the particular ideology of the Islamic State or Hamas or whatever, and every single Muslim in the world needs to be grouped together into this and just punished as a whole. Frankly, it's a crazy idea. It will never work, and it will never help. It deserves to be said in a Liberty podcast once, twice, 1,000 times. It won't work.
And before we switch to the next topic, I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion and say I have a video on my own YouTube channel, which is Aussie Liberty, on this topic of whether Islam is an existential threat to the West, and I talk about a bunch of these issues as well. So you'll go to subscribe to my channel as well. And on that topic,
I was going to say, I think I agree with the ASIO chief on this one. But like moving to the next topic, which is Uluru. Actually, I have no idea about this. I just know there's some sort of reconciliation thing that's going on.
Yeah. So essentially, there was a.
I'll let you take it, Lee. You know about it. Yeah.
No, I'm not going to sneeze. Oh gosh, you know when you anyway. So over the weekend, there was a statement. There was essentially a big kind of shindig in the Northern Territory and at Uluru, and they about reconciliation. And there was essentially it was called the National Constitutional Convention. It's kind of tied into the talks that the government's having about Indigenous recognition of the Constitution.
Yep.
And this went a lot further than that. So for the benefit of those who are not aware, there's been ongoing discussion about, should the preamble to the Constitution talk about the, Torres Strait Islanders and Aboriginal people being here first. This went further by talking about a treaty, or two elements. So there's two aspects. So firstly, they want a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. So like a representative body. And there's also what's called the Makarrata Commission, which is essentially to try and create treaties between the various kind of tribal groupings and different governments.
Yep.
As well as some, also sort of about sort of telling that it says truth telling about our history. So this is a lot more radical than what's been sort of talked about.
You're right.
More or less. Yeah, I was going to say, so Bill Shorten was kind of tepid about it. The coalition has responded quite negatively about it.
Understandably. I remember having this argument before, and I don't know if we did it on the show, but so adding things to the preamble of the Constitution does not mean nothing, right? And I can give you a really good example. So let me read out the actual preamble to people who've never read it before. Whereas the people of New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland and Tasmania, humbly relying on the blessing of Almighty God, have agreed to unite under one indissoluble federal commonwealth under the Crown of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and under the Constitution hereby established. And whereas it is expedient to provide for the admission into the Commonwealth of other Australasian colonies and the possessions of the Queen, be it therefore enacted by the Queen's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same as follows. So yes, it's a bit of a jumble of words, but the reason why I stopped at the word indissoluble is that's the reason why WA hasn't quite been able to secede. Yes.
Yeah, maybe.
That's one of the justifications.
That's one of the justifications. Yeah. Even though we're not, if you noticed very carefully, we're not actually mentioned in the preamble because we didn't get on board for Federation in time. So it's kind of hard to, if you want to make a strict constitutional interpretation, you could say, well, it doesn't really cover us because we're not there.
Well, no, hang on. We have a way of adding, it's right there, expedient power for the admission to the Commonwealth of other Australasian colonies.
Sure, okay.
So we admitted you, so you're bound by this. Yeah. It's indissoluble, mate.
I think that's bullshit anyway. Like it doesn't. It's irrelevant. Like, but anyway, that's a separate discussion we could have about. I think we have had about.
I guess in practical terms, this discussion of the Australian Constitution and amendments to the Australian Constitution, what do they mean for ordinary people that are trying to make sense of this proposal? And looking at it practically speaking, my concern is that it means not bloody much. Other than...
It's symbolic. That's the main point.
Yeah, it's symbolic. And that's my concern because symbolic measures, well, we had a lot of symbolic measures, but symbolic measures don't do altogether much in and of themselves. And we have a problem where we have an Indigenous home ownership corporation handing out home loans to like 100 people a year, and their employed staff are about 100 people. And that is called closing the gap in this country. We have, people getting grants of a few $100,000 to open a hair care salon in the middle of nowhere in Warburton, WA. Mm-hmm. I wrote an article about this on The Spectator. That's why I remember these two facts. And the fact is that this stuff is what politicians think is helping people. And unfortunately, it is not helping people at all. And talking about this referendum and this Indigenous symbolism doesn't help them either, for the same reasons.
Yeah.
Be right back.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably fair to say, yes, the putting into the preamble is purely symbolic. It does mean nothing. I think what the statement they've released is essentially what the end goal was anyway. So I think the getting into the preamble was kind of the first steps towards moving to essentially this issue. And at a first principles level, I'm not wholly opposed to it. Like, I think, again, so shameless self-promotion. I've done a video on whether, to what extent that Aboriginal people have natural rights, have actual claims to the land. I know we've talked about this before, and talked about Mabo and all this kind of stuff as well.
Or rather, how little Mabo actually does, despite the fact that people think it gives them land rights.
Sure, but I mean, at least the acknowledgement that there was essentially there was no terra nullius, and so they do actually have like natural right claim to some aspect of the land. So in that regard, a treaty negotiation, okay, that doesn't seem completely outrageous. A representative body, I think, that advises Parliament. I mean, I want to say at the start, there's issues with both of these things, but I'm just looking at it purely from do we stop at first principles and say, no, this is stupid? So I think a representative body, if you believe in that they have some sort of sovereignty, then some sort of Parliament kind of makes sense. Now, getting to whether these proposals will work, I think they probably won't. Certainly for any kind of representative body, we've already tried it in Australia. So we had ADSIC for 20 years, and it ended up in nepotism. Essentially the sorts of things that Zeev's talking about with like the hairdresser and the Home Loan Corporation.
What you would expect. It's what you would expect when you don't have accountability in a public service thing that's based on symbolism.
And the issues, it seems, were the same problem, which is if you give them power, they use it to do dumb things, and if you don't give them power, then nothing changes. So,
I have people want change above all. So that's the push, right? Correct. So it'll have to be change in this direction, unless people realise that all these government programs and all these statements of symbolism and what have you, I mean, they're not helping. No. What we really need is practical land rights, first of all, not the fake land rights that right now. And that's one thing that at least Warren Mundine is doing a little bit to get towards.
Not just Warren Mundine, but Tim Wilson was moving towards that as well.
Tim Wilson too, yes. But Warren Mundine, at least at the moment, has got some excellent articles in a number of newspapers on the subject, quite recent, which is why I mention it.
Sorry,
yes.
Can I
go on?
Yeah, sorry. So I strongly disagree with the treaty thing. Like, I agree with it, like, as a symbol, and that's to the extent that I agree with the treaty in terms of like what it's actually capable of doing. So the theft of the land in Australia occurred, generations and generations ago. Now, I'm not going to say that we shouldn't be giving the land back where possible, right? But I am saying that a treaty doesn't make sense because effectively there is no difference between an Aboriginal person and an Australian person right now, right? Once they were included in our system of government and granted franchise and included in our census and everything like that, there's effectively no difference between an Aboriginal person and a Australian citizen except with respect to welfare programs. So I don't think a treaty makes much sense when we're not really denying them anything. They're not denied franchise,
except legal rights. Let's. I mean, obviously, their economic and social status is vastly different.
Well, hang on. No. They can
not in all cases, but in a lot of cases.
No. Hang on. If an Aboriginal person buys a property in the same way I buy property, right? There's no different rule between the two of us.
Yeah.
Right. Now, I understand that we're talking here about land that was taken from them a long time ago. Right, and the other problem that's intrinsically an issue with a treaty is it tries to create something that wasn't the case. While Aboriginals did have, a form of governance, they didn't have a form of this representative government that existed, right? It wasn't like they all got together and formed a representative government to go meet with people. They were far more decentralized and destructured than that, right? And I think that this proposal to create a treaty kind of forces them to create something that didn't exist.
And in itself, not a bad thing. But the bad thing, I think, is how do you identify who the leaders are going to be?
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah. How do you identify who is Aboriginal or not for the purpose of this representative body? These are questions that don't have clear answers, and I think that's maybe why it leads to a bit of perception of waste or mismanagement or bureaucracy gone mad, because you have this debate over who is or is not Aboriginal, and then you get into the whole Bolt debate, and everyone goes crazy and hates each other.
So can I just jump in at this point, because I want to come back to something that Vikas just said, because I mean I've heard a lot of people responded to. I've done a number of posts on my Aussie Liberty Facebook page, on this issue, and people have responded by saying, yeah, but one law, one vote, one country, all this kind of stuff.
Yep.
And they weren't included; they were subjugated. So they didn't get a choice. It's if you fought against the Brits, they would shoot you. And so, it didn't make much sense to fight them anymore. You kind of had to just give up, unless you just wanted to be exterminated, which, most people don't. So really, they've not ever been given a real choice about the nature of their inclusion in Australian society. Like, it's not like the Brits came along and said, oh, you can stay outside or you can come join us. They just said, this is all now ours, and if you raise your fist against us, we will, smash you into the ground. So going to the notion of it, so I acknowledge all the issues that you guys raised of who are the leaders and who's Aboriginal and who's not. I agree with those criticisms, but I think at the sort of core point, I don't think they've never really been our countrymen. Like, for people, there are people out there who still truly believe that they have been subjugated. They're not really Australians. They've been forced to be Australians because they have no alternative. But they, I think if they were given the choice to essentially set up a sovereign nation, they would take that.
Yeah.
And I think if that was the case, if there were people who were saying, we want our land and we're going to be sovereign, much like you sort of have sort of a quasi-sovereignty for Native Americans in the United States, which is, it's a shitty system there too, but it's a little bit different and in some ways less, at least they acknowledge that they're separate nations. If you had that sort of system, you could have a treaty because they're essentially not Australians. My problem with this talk of treaty, though, is I think what they're aiming to do is have a separate welfare state within the welfare state. So then I don't think they're actually, at least the leadership of this kind of thing, they're not saying we actually want to be separate. They're saying we want to be part of Australia. We just want control of the welfare money and we want to allocate it ourselves. And I think that just comes down to the governance issues that we've already mentioned, of accountability and all this sort of stuff. And, if you've got a bunch of illiterate Northern Territorians who have never had a job and have, dropped out of school and have destroyed their minds with booze and petrol, how are they going to keep their leaders accountable? Essentially just swapping one set of elites for another set of elites. So in that regard, I'm not in favor of this kind of proposal, but I think at a core principle, you can sign a treaty because these people can be separate.
Sorry, I think at a fundamental level, the treaty doesn't make sense either because you don't sign treaties with your conquered peoples.
Yes. Well, not historically, but since we're moving
not historically.
Yeah, sure. But at least historically, at least they acknowledge that they conquered them. So, at least there's an element of honesty there, which I think most people have not grappled with. Because you say, we conquered them, and they say, no, we didn't. And it's like, well, what else do you call a situation where you say all of this land is now ours, and if you resist us, we're going to gun you down? But I mean, it's a separate issue. But at least that has an answer. And since we're moving to a more just system, we can sign a treaty because we can set up whatever future we like. And if we acknowledge that we have done this injustice, and we want to try and start something afresh, or create a new history for Australia, I think you can sign a treaty. You can say, we do. Of course, the Australian government has all the power. There's issues with that as well. But I think in terms of, how do you get from a crappy situation to a less crappy situation that at least maybe might do something to ameliorate some of the historical injustices? It's not ridiculous to make this suggestion. I think there's issues. You need to work, the exact model that they're suggesting seems kind of a bit crazy for reasons already stated, but I think as libertarians we can work with that. I think as a libertarian you can say there is something in this that is worthwhile, that is worth pursuing, so that people who believe they are truly sovereign can go and live their lives.
Sorry, well, there's something to that, Lee. That's true enough. I guess I would note though that this is already a few. Well, it's well past invasion. I think the UK government took full control of Australia for quite a while, and the original inhabitants or tribal inhabitants are well and truly gone. Their ancestors are here, but I don't know if they're really living in quite the same circumstances, and whether they would really want a reservation type system. They're certainly not proposing a reservation type system.
But no, they're not. So, sure.
No, they're not, because the problem with the reservation type system is, like Lee pointed out, they'd like to have more control over the welfare money. Like, ideally, based on what I've read from their suggestions, it's almost like they want a welfare state within a welfare state.
Yeah.
Now, I think the reservation model is probably the best go. I think it sorts out the property rights issue. As long as, and once you've declared their land sovereign, I'm sitting there going like, sure, let the miners come in and, get those mineral resources off you. Sure, develop, build your own casinos or whatever you want to do, right? I'm totally fine with them doing all of those things and making some money for their tribe. Or, even if they wanted to like adopt like a more modern sort of attitude and start partitioning the land off for people and going, you own that land, you do whatever you need to do.
Yeah.
All that sort of thing. I would love for them to work out things, but as long as they're given, like, this is your sovereign territory, it's your sovereign reservation, you can do whatever you want with it.
Yeah, see, the reservation system, I think, is not really a solution either, because essentially it's just a fiction over the top of the fact that the federal government is kind of in control. So if you actually look at how it played out, the Indians were promised all these reservations and promised all this land, and whenever the feds wanted it, they just went and took the land. So if you actually look at the history of how it's worked out,
not well.
It hasn't worked out very well for those tribes. And essentially, when the US was expanding into those areas, which were all set aside for native tribes, they were just taken over. And you've got the Trail of Tears.
How far back are you going here? You're going back like to Andrew Jackson, yeah.
Yeah. But, 200 years is not a very long period of time. Like, it's one thing to say, okay, let's redress the rights of the Picts going back to when the Anglo-Saxons came. Like, that's ridiculous. It'll be almost impossible to sort out. But 200 years is not a long period of time. Like,
no, it's not.
The American Revolution is still celebrated by everybody all time. And that's the period of time which we're talking about. Like, 1776 was 2 years before the Australian First Fleet landed. If that's not a thing worth talking about and thinking is relevant, then I don't see why the conquest of Australia is not relevant.
I'm not saying it's not relevant. I'm saying, like, the reservations. So you're talking about two different types of reservations. Like I'm talking about the sovereign land that was handed back to these to the natives over the course from like the 50s through to the 80s, and I think they're still getting handed back now. It's not the same as what Andrew Jackson proposed, because Andrew Jackson basically decided there was a manifest destiny for the United States to effectively rule the Americas, and that's a whole part of their history that you can really go and read up. Manifest Destiny is a very interesting topic if you ever want to get into American history. But we're talking about two different things here, because there was a period where they were handing back a lot of reservations, and it spurred on it's kind of regarded as a bit of a derogatory statement, but like the Indian casinos, which, the casinos that were put on Indian land because they couldn't, because, the states had anti-gambling provisions. And a lot of those businesses, they're in profit sharing with the actual, like, tribe people.
Yeah.
So
and it's entirely self-policed as well. They don't, like,
Yeah, so, that's an okay way forward. The sovereignty I'm talking about is, like, actual sovereignty. I think the reason why you wouldn't have actual sovereign countries is because nobody wants to live in an island land and have a separate country. Like, it just wouldn't... Even with the miners, like, it wouldn't be a nice place to live. It's like, you can give sovereignty to PNG, but who wants to live in PNG? Like, no one.
Why would their ancestors have lived there then? I mean, I'm sitting there going like, your ancestors lived there. I'm sitting there going like, your ancestors lived there. That's your special connection with the land. Sure. Your special connection isn't with every part of the land.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so I don't believe the Brits stole all the land. They just stole all the Aboriginals' land. There was plenty of land that wouldn't, like, under a Lockean system, was not owned. You know, it was just, even if you had 1 million Aboriginals, wide-ranging, you still have massive tracts of land that would be unowned. But, I mean, I presume that most of the good stuff was taken. Like, I imagine, you know, if along all the rivers, along all the coast, you know, like, so, I mean, Arnhem Land, there would have been very few of that land because...
That's just a little too theoretical, even for a libertarian audience.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, like, just you took it. But, I mean, I think just to sort of get back to the issue, I don't think anybody actually wants real sovereignty. Like, I mean, if you gave me the option of having a massive tract of land to be completely sovereign from Australia, I'd take it in a heartbeat, because as a libertarian, I'm like, there's so much opportunity there to do something. But I think for most Aboriginal people, they don't want to live like that. They want to be part of Australia, but they want more control of their destiny. Unfortunately, the methods that I think they're going down will not essentially end in the same failure that all other government programs finish in, and all the programs that we've seen before, including ATSIC, which is cronyism and incompetence and the rest of it. So
and with that,
I hope not.
And with that dull sort of statement, I want to end this episode because I think we've gone a significant amount over time.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that was episode 13. Now Lee will be going to Canada for the next 6 weeks.
We'll still be doing the show.
Why?
Just the background.
He'll still be on the show. No, I wasn't saying that. He didn't let me finish that part.
Sure.
But you know, he's going to Canada, so whatever. But he'll be joining us from Canada, and we'll probably have a whole bunch of things. So I think we're going to be organising something with the Unshackled guys soon. Cool. So stay tuned for that.
And actually, this week, Zeev and I are going to be sitting down for a chat at some point to talk about his article on bail laws. So
yes.
That's going to happen.
Yeah, so that's going to be a thing. So watch out for that.
Okay, cool. All right. See everyone next week.
See you guys
next week.